So this is part 9 or 8. I don't know. Starts on August 4th, 2023. I had 5 issues of Fast Food Legend magazine at this point. I had moved on to a real printer, a real print shop for these, and they were no longer photocopies, but really high-quality digital prints. But I couldn't afford the staples, so I had bought a stapler, and I was getting these prints done in bulk and then take them home and staple them. And I see from my pictures that I was matting and bagging all the prints to sell. And I had gotten a tent, the right size canopy tent, and weights and all this stuff. I was really getting ready to do this market, and clearly if I was investing this much time and money, I anticipated that I'd be doing a lot more markets. On August 9th, I realized that the library would let me print a 36 by 42 as opposed to the 24 by 36s I had been doing this whole time. So I printed out a 36 by 42 of the bucket. And it looks so great. And I wanted to figure out how to make other large size prints. And AI upscaling stuff was starting to get a lot better by this point. And I think I was experimenting with taking the posters I'd already done and blowing them up. Now, on August 11th, I was preparing. I guess the first market I did was August 12th, the one in Eagle Rock. And I had no point of purchase materials. I had no banner. I had no signage. I had no nothing. So, but what I did have was a lot of Burger King packaging materials. And using old school DIY, crafting, whatever, I repurposed all of the Burger King packaging materials into the original signage and displays for the first market. The first market I did was on August 12th, 2023 in Eagle Rock, and it was a complete disaster. My tent broke. I broke somebody else's tent by accident. The weights I had purchased weren't nearly heavy enough, and the booth kept flying away. It was literally on the sidewalk. So people were just, nobody was there to buy anything. It was a real disaster. I had a migraine headache. I had rented a table from a place across the street, but they closed before the market was over. So the next morning, after having been in pain and made no money and just raking all the stuff I had worked so hard to create, I had to drive all the way back to Eagle Rock just to return the table. It was a truly miserable experience. But I also figured, the first one of these you do is going to be bad, so might as well get it out of the way. I don't know the timeline for this exactly, but let me find the name of that. Trying to find the name. It's a foundation, Wiseman Art Foundation. So I had been on a tour of the Wiseman Art Foundation at some point before this. And near the end of the tour, they really encourage you to visit the Venice Art Crawl for some reason. I believe that they had mentioned that the foundation actually looks for new artists at this art crawl, something like that. But I figured if they were pushing it this heavily, there was probably something to it, and I should look into it. And I had gone down to, it's something involved with like the Chamber of Commerce. You have to go to a mixer that they have several times a year and introduce yourself to everybody and find people who are hosting events in Venice during the art crawl to get a spot to show your art. And the woman who runs it is named Sunny. And my initial emails and texts with her were kind of cold, and I didn't understand and all this. But I went down to the mixer, and what I did that was kind of tacky but kind of necessary was I brought a portfolio. And Sunny was a very well-known photographer, and in the course of the evening, I got her to look at the portfolio, and I could see her face change in a certain way that I think all artists recognize other real artists. I certainly make that face when you see it, when you get it, and you've never seen it before, and all that kind of stuff. And Sunny made the face, and I was in, and there wasn't a lot of communication. I didn't know up until maybe 2 or 3 days before the event that there was a space for me somewhere. And a man named Elliot contacted me and said he's got a space and to come down. And I really didn't know what I was doing. The tent I brought was 10 times too big for everything. And I had brought portable projector because it was an outdoor thing. And I was thinking about how all those restaurants like 30 years ago would project the name of the restaurant onto the sidewalk in front of the restaurant, and you'd stop because a lot of people stare at their feet. So I made a video loop of not all, but a bunch of the TikTok videos and loaded them into the projector. And originally I was going to project onto the sidewalk to stop people, but it wasn't really possible. So I projected onto a driveway of somebody's house because you were just set up in the middle of the street in the Venice canals. And anyway, it worked, and it was a really incredible experience because it was the first time, nobody had seen any of this stuff other than the librarians, the copy shop, and the people that stopped me on the street, and, a handful of friends on Instagram, but they hadn't really seen them work in person or whatever. So this was all just strangers. And, before I'd even coughed, I'd made a couple $100. It was insane. A lot of people just ripping the booth apart, going crazy for all of it, being so complimentary, and totally different crowd than I'd seen anywhere else in LA. I mean, it was really very rewarding experience. A lot of young people, 20s, maybe even teens, really got it, really went crazy about it. And my friend was with me, and he had his paintings. I'd gotten him a space, and he didn't even really bother to display them. He just put them on the ground. He wasn't a serious artist, so I wasn't thinking about it too much. But at some point I looked at him, and his reaction really signaled to me that this was something was happening we hadn't quite seen before with this stuff. There was clearly an audience for it. It wasn't just me and a few people who thought it was clever or interesting. And it was kind of a relief that this thing that had started with intentionally trying to make the stupidest thing possible and converting it into something a lot more intelligent was working. On August 21st, because of the success of this, I really wanted to make more issues of the magazine, and I went to In-N-Out Burger again right when they opened, just to photograph, to do an In-N-Out issue. And on August 27th, now that I knew that I could sell this stuff, and I knew that I could get away from TikTok and I could get more into art, but I didn't have all the mechanics of the displays for the market because a lot of the videos I'd watched on how you sell at markets were for indoor markets, especially like anime, artist alley stuff at Comic Cons and things like that. I'd watched some about outdoor markets, but they weren't appropriate for the climate I was in, I guess. So I went down to Melrose Trading Post just to explore how do you build the booths. How do you build booths that really won't fly away and are appropriate for the amount of stuff you have and all that kind of thing. And the people were really nice and very helpful and very educational when I asked questions, and I saw exactly how makeshift it was. And in that, I saw an entirely other kind of artistry that I don't think I've ever seen documented anywhere. Just how you put flea market booths together in that particular kind of a way. I know how you sell junk, like if you're selling used goods or whatever at a terrible swap meet. That I can do with my eyes closed. But when you're actually trying to build a display that looks good and has something to it, it's a whole other art form. And it was really great to see how people put things together and gave me a lot of ideas. And part of that was how to display the magazines themselves. I ended up using a lot of things that were used to display greeting cards, but they're not that well designed in terms of having to strike and put back together over and over again. Greeting card displays are generally meant for retailers with a permanent location. Anyway, so I spent a few days on displays, point of purchase, booth design. And I remember I bought a lot of PVC pipe, and I had my clippers and making experiments in my living room of how can you do this, how can you do that, and just coming up with ideas, sketching ideas for what this booth was going to look like. And also, I knew from the class I had taken that when I was going to submit to all of these markets, this is a really interesting part of the story that I have to think about for a minute. As an outsider, if you want to sell at all the flea markets in LA, it appears to be extremely competitive and heavily curated. And as I told you earlier, when you took the class about getting into markets, they teach you how to create a proposal for the markets, which is a lot more involved than you'd think. And I knew from the past, from other things, I'd tried to contact these markets and I'd get no reply whatsoever. And I knew other people who had tried to get in touch with these markets and they'd get no reply whatsoever. So we just assumed that this dialogue about them being very competitive was real, right? And all the markets always say that they want more artists. And you're thinking, well, I'm an artist. I'm what you're looking for. Why aren't you calling me back? Why aren't you emailing me back? And it gets, it's like this thing. Okay. So there's a format. There's a very clear format that I learned from taking that class about how you submit a proposal for a booth at a market. And one of the things you have to do is have a photograph of your booth. Now, as I had no booth yet, and I didn't have space to really set up a booth yet, I realized I could just make a Photoshop mock-up that would be good enough, which is what I did. But I couldn't have made the mock-up until I had been to all of the markets and seen how they were designed and seen how to make these displays. But somewhere around here, around August 30th, 2023, I finally had a vision of what that was going to look like in some way, and I was able to make these proposals. And the proposal is more intricate than just a photo of the booth, but the photo of the booth is the centerpiece of the proposal. And again, that's a whole other art form that I learned that I had no idea existed, was just booth proposal sheets. Really interesting, actually. Really interesting thing. So, okay. Here's the secret I learned is that when you have a strong proposal sheet like that, every market says yes immediately. All the markets that had turned me down, except for one at UCLA, All the markets that had turned me down or ignored me or anything else all said yes within 5 seconds of seeing the proposal sheet. The proposal sheet is sort of a secret handshake that you're responsible and you know what you're doing and you're business-minded and everything else. So that's from the outsider point of view. Okay. Now it's August 31st, and I'm preparing to do the Orange County Zine Fest. This is going to be my first Zine Fest. And I have meticulously read this booklet that they send with all the instructions and all the guidelines. One of the things that all these Zine Fests really push is that you have a unique tablecloth, because a lot of them, you're sharing a table with somebody else. Because zines are so small, you differentiate the space with your own tablecloth. I certainly wasn't going to start sewing or buying fabric or anything like that. So, again, I had a lot of Burger King packaging materials. I got to pause. So I had a lot of Burger King packaging materials left, and I created a tablecloth out of them, which was it's amazing. They tell you to do the tablecloth, and you're thinking it's nonsense, but every few people walk up to the booth and start talking about the tablecloth. People really notice it. It was great, and they really liked it. Okay. So on September 9th, I had the first Zine Fest, the Orange County Zine Fest. I didn't know what to expect. And it was at the library in Anaheim on Harbor, just down the street from Disneyland. And I just loved being there. I really like visiting Anaheim. There's something about, it's a certain kind of suburb that I'd seen in movies growing up that was completely foreign to me. And something about reconciling that in real life as an adult I found very appealing. My table was in the basement, and I didn't really understand what I was seeing at the time. I was very tired. I was showing stuff that I guess that I knew that the stuff I was showing didn't belong there. But I also didn't know where else to show it. And I was I'm trying to think of the words. When the event started, people kind of looked at what I had and walked away. And the table next to me, whatever they were selling a lot of. And this happened to me over and over again. Anyway, my sort of natural salesperson started to come out after an hour or two. And every person that walked up the table, even if they didn't say hello, like just anything, I'd just go right into sales pitch. And I started pointing to the bucket and that's 350 packets of KFC sauce that I poured one at a time. And after I said that and they looked at it, they'd say, "Oh," and then they'd get really involved with everything on the table. But just naturally looking at it, they didn't know what it was and they didn't want to ask. And they weren't naturally curious enough to figure it out on their own. But by doing that, I got a fair amount of business and a lot of new fans. And it was an exhausting day. I don't think I was very happy about it at the time, but in retrospect, it was a pretty good experience. But again, I knew. I think the reason I was unhappy was that I knew that whatever it was I had made didn't really fit in with the stuff that I saw around me, and in a bad way. The next event I had was on September 14th, 2023, in a brewery in downtown LA, and it was called Art and Booze. And this would be the first really bad event. It's so hard to talk. I got to pause again. Okay, so this was the first really bad event that I worked, and The people that ran the event told me that at the last event they had had hundreds and hundreds of people there, but almost nobody was at the event the night that I set up there. I had to stand on my feet for about 8 or 10 hours, and there were very few customers. And once again, I could see that whatever I was doing did not fit in correctly with what everybody else was doing. And again, in kind of a bad way. The other problem I was experiencing with all of this was I had brought too much stuff. I had all of the Fast Food Legend stuff, but at the same time, I had started a line of coloring books, which took up half the table. And I didn't have a clear focus. I think I was just kind of excited after the Zine Fest and after the Venice Art Crawl to have a space to show people things that I had made. And instead of being focused, I just started bringing everything, which was a big mistake. But it wouldn't even have mattered because there was nobody there. There was nobody there. 4 days later, I had been, okay, this is lost somewhere in here, but I must have been applying to gallery shows and art contests and things like that somewhere before here, which is yet another art form I had learned. And I got accepted into my first art show. Well, it wasn't my first ever art show, but my first art show with all the Fast Food Legend stuff. And definitely the first art show I had been in at least a decade. And that was at the Santa Clarita Arts at Santa Clarita City Hall. Oh, God, there's so much to remember here. I got to pause again. Okay, I think I'm prepared now to explain this part of the story. So, at the library, as I said, I had quickly outgrown what I could do with the free printing at the library. And I don't have it documented, but I must have been applying to all these art shows and things, and I got accepted to the Santa Clarita thing, and their guidelines stated that the work must be framed. And I didn't have a lot of money. And there was a picture framing shop in West Hollywood that always had a sign in front of like a sandwich board on the street about they had a cheap special for 24 by 36. I think it was less than $100 for the frame. Now, I believe I told you that sometimes the library would have different kinds of paper in the wide format printer. And so because I was printing so much, I had multiple versions of the same poster on different kinds of paper. And one of the papers, and I can't remember the name, but I think it may have been called Luster. One of the papers just looked incredible, just incredible. And one of the papers was just kind of average. And I know because I'd priced it out up in Glendale to print all of the posters in a print shop on that better paper was about $70 each print. And I couldn't afford that, especially as I had no practical use for any of this art and nowhere to display it. I was Googling about dry mounting photos that had been printed on the nicer paper, and it wasn't quite clear whether it was possible or not. So when I went to the to the frame shop, I brought two kinds of photos for each of the two images that were going in the Santa Clarita show, one on each kind of paper. And I said to the woman that worked there, I'm bringing you these because in case there's a problem with the dry mounting, you have a backup to work with. And to please text me if there was a problem. I don't know how to say it, but you can just tell when a stupid person is lying, basically is what it comes down to. And I sort of could tell as I was dropping it off that they were just going to throw away the good ones and claim there was a problem and give me back the lesser quality ones. I could just kind of tell. And that's more or less what happened. There was no evidence of the, she told me that the dry mount destroyed the pictures, but there was no evidence of it, and no photos, no text, no nothing. And I felt very limited in what I could do because of the, one, where I was, and two, the financial constraints of where I was. But I did get back something. They looked, I thought, not very good framed. But at that point, I had no choice. I had to deliver what I had. And I went up to Santa Clarita and dropped them off. And then you had to go back a few days later to see the show hung. And I have to tell you, it was very satisfying. And it felt very good to finally see these things on the wall somewhere. I stayed there for way too long looking at them on the wall because I couldn't believe that something that had started off as how do we make this stupider and how do we make it stupider was finally becoming a vision of real art that I was proud of and had something to say. But there was that underlining frustration of being constrained partially by my skills and partially just by finances and partially by geography.